Welcome. It's a pleasure being back in London. Thank you all for coming out this evening. And this evening we're going to be talking about curiosities, crackpots and charlatans. We're exploring the margins of Jewish history. That is the topic tonight. I'm not at any moment during the talk, the lecture, going to identify who's a curiosity, who's a crackpot, and who is a charlatan. I will leave that totally to your imagination. And afterwards, if you want me to specifically identify anyone, whether they have been discussed in the lecture or not, we can have that discussion, but privately. I'm dedicating this evening to my late father, whose yahrzeit is tonight, 8 years since he passed away. Le'ilu nishmasoi, Avram Moshe ben Moreno Rav Yosef Tzvi Halevi. He was a remarkable man. I miss him every day. I think about him every day. And particularly when I'm at an event like this and speaking about subjects that I know would have been extremely interesting for him, I miss him even more. There's a lot of thank yous tonight. I want to begin by thanking a dear friend of mine in New York, Moshe Yarmish. I don't know if any of you know him. I was in yeshiva with him. I attended his wedding, I believe. And he has the largest, but by far, the largest collection of photographs of rabbis dating back to who knows when in the world. And he is a source of incredible information for me, but particularly because I like to illustrate my lectures with photographs and images. He has been enormously helpful to me, and I'd like to thank him for that. In this particular lecture, he furnished me with information, even more than photographs, which perhaps I'll go into later. And if any of you have photographs of obscure ancestors or rabbis, please let me know and let me pass them on to him, because he is a repository of this information and incredibly useful to people like me, and therefore to people like you, when we want to discover aspects and elements of Jewish history. I also want to thank Nei Yisrael and Toras Chaim for hosting me this evening. I'm grateful for the collaboration, grateful to the rabbi who is here. Thank you so much for hosting me. And hopefully this is the first visit of many, although I must tell you that this is my first public address in London since leaving in 2011. Hopefully I won't have to wait another 8 years. I want to begin by saying that every time I come to London, and it's happened here this evening actually, every time I come to London, people say to me, "So Nu, when are you coming back?" And I always reply, "Ein novi be'iroi." There's no such thing as a prophet in his city. It's a chazal, right? It's a chazal. It's quoted by some of the most distinguished rabbis. We have it here on the screen. Some of the most distinguished rabbis of Jewish history. I've just taken here a very basic selection. Rabbeinu Yosef Yavitz writes in his Sefer on Pirkei Avos, he says, "Omru Razal, Chazal teach us, Ein novi be'ira, you cannot be a prophet in your own city." Rav Shlomo Al-Ghazi, writing in his Sefer Alpha Beta, Va'al zeh yoimra moshlim, ein novi be'iroi. You can't be a novi, a prophet in your own city. And most famously of all, quoted by the Chassam Sofer in his Tshuvas on Choshe Mishpat, Tshuva number Chof Beis, Va'omru Chazal, ein novi be'iroi. Now, I'm willing to lay a bet that you will not find Ein novi be'iroi anywhere in Chazal. You can search through Bavli, Yerushalmi, Sifri, Sifra, Mechilta, Tosefta, any Medrash. You will not find this phrase, Ein novi be'iroi. However, if you are a scholar of the New Testament, you will find it quoted not once but 4 times in the name of none other than Jesus. And Jesus told them a prophet is honored everywhere except in his own city. That's in Mark. Matthew, Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own city. John, chapter 4, verse 44. He himself had said that a prophet is not honored in his own city. By the way, he was referring to himself, having revisited Bethlehem. He was not treated with quite the veneration that he was expecting. And the fourth one is from the Gospel of Thomas, not quite the New Testament, but affiliated and associated. Jesus said, no prophet is accepted in his own city. So you're probably wondering to yourself, having just discovered from Pini Dunner, that something you had always considered to be a chazal isn't, why the Chassam Sofer, who certainly wasn't someone who knew the New Testament very well, would have quoted it in reference to a tshuva. Well, go figure. I will leave that mystery for you to ponder in your own time. I don't really have an answer. And as to whether this changes anything regarding my return to London, I guess that also remains to be seen. But once I'm on the subject of returning to London, when did the Jews, the Jewish community, return to London after the expulsion of 1290? Anyone ever considered that? So you know the answer. The answer is 1656. Very good. Jews in England between 1290 and 1656. We're going to start discussing something about which you know very little, but which is an important topic because you can throw the Jews out, but they never leave. You know what the difference is between a Jew and a Gentile? A Gentile doesn't say goodbye and leaves. A Jew says goodbye and never leaves. So all in all, there were around 2,000 Jews living in England at the time that King Edward I disposed of them by expelling them. It wasn't something that happened in a flash. It actually happened over a period of 100 years. We know that in 1190 there was this terrible massacre at York, and over time restrictions against the Jews increased and increased until in 1290 Edward I expelled them. And we know that in 1650, Manasseh ben Israel wrote a book, a very little-known book today, but an extremely important book when it was published. It's called The Hope of Israel. There's actually a copy of it in the Jews College Library. It's one of the very few rare books that's actually left in Jews College Library, but that's perhaps a discussion for another time. It was first written in Latin and Spanish, and later on it was published. Here you have the 1652 edition, which came out in English. It described how Jews needed to be spread out to the ends of the earth. It's a pasuk in Dvarim. Look in Dvarim, Perek Chof Ches, pasuk Samach Daled. You'll see that they need to be B'ktsei Ha'aretz. Well, nowhere is more the end of the earth than the British Isles, apparently. And there were millenarian Christians who were extremely concerned that as an impediment to the arrival, for them, the second arrival of the Messiah, that was a great impediment. There were no Jews living in the British Isles, so we need to import a few Jews so that the second coming can happen. And they began to lobby Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was the Lord Protector of Great Britain. After he had deposed Charles I, there was a civil war, and he was told that you need to readmit the Jews. He was a very religious man, but by the way, the Puritans were not monolithic. There were those Puritans who were very pro-Jewish. There were plenty of Puritans who hated Jews as well. But Manasseh ben Israel arrived in London in 1655 to lobby Oliver Cromwell, let the Jews back in so that the Messiah can come. And the issue became very controversial. Cromwell hesitated, and a formal meeting was called. It was called the Whitehall Conference. They brought experts from all over Great Britain. And if you want to make sure something doesn't get done, all you need to do is organize a conference. So this conference was extremely successful in not reaching a conclusion. By the way, we don't need that anymore because we have the United Nations. We have a permanent place where decisions can't be taken. The formal conclusion of the conference was that there is no law which forbids the Jews return to England. You see, it was by royal decree. King Edward I had decreed that all the Jews need to be expelled from England, and there was no law to say that they couldn't live there. The legal position was therefore that Jews could return, and if they returned, yes, they would be in danger of expulsion, but they could live in England. And it wasn't until 1753, which is almost 100 years later, that Jewish legal status in Britain was finally confirmed by an Act of Parliament, only for that Act of Parliament to immediately be overturned a year later. Finally, historians generally date full Jewish emancipation in this country. I'm sure you all knew this. I'm saying it for the online audience because all of you are experts in British Jewish history. Was 1829, possibly because that was the Catholic emancipation, or perhaps it was 1858, the Jews Relief Act. This is the Jewish emancipation as reported in a newspaper called The Chronicle. And by the way, I need to tell you an anecdote. When I first became a rabbi, I was befriended by a man who you've probably all heard of called Dr. Lionel Koplowitz. Dr. Lionel Koplowitz was for a time the president of the Board of Deputies and very involved in all kinds of Anglo-Jewish affairs. Very interesting man, and likes to tell stories. I'm being careful here. In any event, he told me that for the 300th anniversary of the readmittance of Jews into Great Britain, into England, the Jewish Chronicle wanted to do a special. I actually have that special. It was published around the time of the 300th anniversary. And what they wanted to do was interview descendants of the Jews who were in the initial group who came together with Menashe ben Israel so that they could include them in this tribute supplement of the Jewish Chronicle. Any Jew who was involved with the Jewish community, 300 years later, they couldn't find one who was still Jewish. That means there are descendants of those Jews. Not one of them is involved in the community or even Jewish. Just something to reflect on, I think. Anyway, 6 weeks ago, Dr. Koplowitz, he's now age 92, although on the slide it looks like he could be almost 93, created quite a sensation when he announced to the Board of Deputies, Corbin in Hebrew is korban, which is sacrificed, and I think we should sacrifice him for all the trouble he has caused. He has since apologized for his quote, which he said he was guilty of clumsy rhetoric, something for which he's never apologized before. Anyway, I digress. I actually want to talk about the period between 1290 and 1656. That's what this particular part of the lecture is about. The time of no Jews in England. Because besides for the very first years after expulsion, there was not a time during the years 1290 to 1656 when there were no Jews in England. There were always Jews in England. I won't mention every Jew who lived in England during those years, just a couple of interesting ones. And I don't want you to think that because there were Jews in England, there was a shul called Reb Chuna's on Gold's Green Road that had a minyan every 15 minutes every morning. That's not what I'm discussing. There were Jews living in England who were openly known as Jews and considered as Jews by the Gentiles who lived there and who were never expelled. So let's start with one. In 1485, Henry VII was a king, Tudor king, the first Tudor king. He was finally victorious against Richard III in the civil war known as the War of the Roses, which was a very long war, 1455 until really 1487. And he struck a deal. This is King Henry VII struck a deal with Spain, and part of the deal was that his son Arthur had to marry Princess Catherine of Aragon. I pause only for effect. Look at her face. In 1501, Arthur died 2 or 3 months after marrying Princess Catherine of Aragon. Again, I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions. Not wanting to lose the treaty with Spain, King Henry married his next son, Henry, to Catherine in 1509. Now, Henry VIII, that's him, large fellow, wanted a male heir, But Catherine, she had many miscarriages and stillbirths, and eventually in 1516 she did produce a daughter, Mary. And Henry became quite frustrated by this, and he asked the Pope, whose name was Clement VII, to annul the marriage. You probably know this part of the story, but the Pope was a virtual prisoner of a chap called Charles V. He was the Holy Roman Emperor. He was also the King of Spain. He was the King of the Netherlands. And he was Catherine's cousin. And either the Pope refused to help, or he never actually heard the request from Henry VIII. But either way, Catherine of Aragon remained firmly married to King Henry VIII, and he was getting extremely frustrated for all kinds of reasons, not least of which is that he wanted a male heir, and she seemed incapable of producing one. So Henry turned elsewhere for help, and step in a former rabbi, a convert to Christianity officially. In those days, if a Jew converted to Christianity, he did so mainly for social reasons. I say that, what I really mean is he didn't want to get killed. Well, you can't be sociable if you're dead. So, and his name was Marco Raphael Venice. See, Henry was very vexed by a contradiction in the Hebrew scriptures. How many monarchs or heads of state today do you know who get vexed by contradictions in the Hebrew scriptures? But here's the contradiction. In Vayikra, in Leviticus 18:16, it says, Ervas eishes achicha lo yisegale, ervas achicha hi. You're not allowed to engage with your brother's wife in a relationship because it's your brother's wife. And that relationship belongs to your brother. Well, I think that's quite explicit, isn't it? Well, the problem is that in Devarim, chapter Chof Hei, it says, Ki yeshvu achim yachdav, umeis achad mehem. If two brothers live together and one of them dies, uvein ein loy, and that brother has no son, loy sia eshes hameis hachutza leish zor, you can't let the brother's wife marry somebody else, to a person outside of the family. Yevama yavai aleha ulekocha loy leisha vayibma. There has to be a levirate marriage. The brother must now marry his late brother's widow so that she remains within the family. It's called yibum. But one second, didn't we just see in Vayikra that you're not allowed to marry your brother's wife? So how is it possible that yibum is allowed? So which is it? Are you allowed to marry your brother's wife? You're not allowed to marry your brother's wife? So can you imagine that this is the problem that Henry VIII was dealing with while having coffee and cake every day? And he was really very vexed by it. I mean, I have to tell you, he'd obviously never seen the Yerushalmi in Nedarim, because the Yerushalmi Nedarim says very clearly, Tanya, ervas eishes achicha v'yavama yava eleha, b'dibur echad nemru. This is, by the way, a standard process. You've ever heard shomer v'zocher b'dibur echad? So this formula of things being said or given together as one concept is a regular instrument that's used by the Yerushalmi to explain contradictions in the Torah. So whereas we know it says Shomer in one of the Aseret HaDibros, it says Zochar in the other one, no problem. Shomer v'Zochar b'dibur echad. Here we have another example where whatever it says in Vayikra about not marrying your brother's wife, and whatever it says in Deuteronomy, in Dvarim, about marrying your brother's wife, but dibur echad nemru. The Torah Tamima points out, you can look at it on the Parsha, he says that the Talmud Yerushalmi uses this device, and in fact, this is a source for the concept of asay doiche loisasay, that you can have a positive and affirmative commandment that pushes away a negative one. That's the idea of bedibur echad. Anyway, this is all lost on poor Henry. He had no idea, he'd never seen the Yerushalmi. And he went to Marco Raphael of Venice. He was a Venetian Jew, converted to Christianity. And he hit the big time. You think that Shark Tank is a new idea. It's not a new idea at all. There was this concept of Shark Tank. There was a committee of 10 in Venice. They didn't have 4 of them. They had 10 sharks, and you used to come and propose your idea to this committee of 10, and if they liked it, they would invest in it. Believe it or not, we're going back 500 years. And this Marco Raphael of Venice invented a unique formula for invisible ink. Very important if you're a spy, to have invisible ink. And he proposed it to the committee of 10. They invested a lot of money, and he became extremely wealthy. And he became the chief cipherist for the diplomatic service of Venice, which is a very esteemed position. And he was also reputed to be a great Talmudic scholar. And in 1530, he traveled to England to assist the king in his case for getting rid of Catherine. At first, he suggested chalitza. I mean, that's the most obvious one. Well, that wasn't going to work. His argument, listen to this, you have to listen to this one. His argument was that since Talmudic times, Yibum had been abandoned. That means no brother whose brother died with a wife and they had no children would marry that brother's wife. That concept had been abandoned, so the marriage needed to be annulled. It needed to be voided. What's interesting about that is that unless Marco Raphael considered Henry VIII to be an Ashkenazi, it's hard to understand why he would have suggested that this was a problem, because in Sephardi communities, they did used to practice Yibum. So perhaps he thought he was somewhere from the north of Europe, it's all okay for him. What happens in Venice stays in Venice, but what happens in the UK is different. Whatever it is, Henry wasn't convinced by this svara, and he found the advice unacceptable. So Raphael suggested, and now this is really tarta de sastra, you need to be a Talmudic scholar to come up with this one. He said, okay, don't annul that marriage, remain married to your brother's wife, just marry another wife. So in this instance, Henry became a Sephardi. Henry rejected this idea as well, and Marco Raphael disappeared from the scene, and in fact from the records, we don't know where he went. But an interesting Jewish phenomenon at the heart of one of the most famous scandals of the British royal family. Let's jump a generation back to Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I was the daughter of Henry VIII from his second wife, Anne Boleyn, the one who caused all the problems. And in 1581, Elizabeth appointed Roderigo Lopez as the royal physician. He was a converso. So we know that there was a concept of a Marano Jew, that means a crypto Jew. They would convert for social reasons, but they would remain Jewish at home. That's what he was. He was eventually discovered to be a Marano in Portugal, and they expelled him. So he moved to London. He married another Jewish woman, converso, and they pretended to be Anglicans, because that was the new religion of the UK, and they secretly practiced Judaism. Now, he may or may not have been a good doctor. I have no idea what it meant to be a good doctor in the 1500s, but I can tell you this, he was an extremely good salesman and a fantastic networker. And he became very successful as the doctor to the stars. He had an A-list clientele, including the Queen, who absolutely adored him, and he made one very dangerous enemy. Somebody who became very jealous of him, a chap called Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. He was a court favourite, terrible womanizer, and he was treated by Lopez for VD in 1594. I'm guessing that if you're a doctor to the stars, you don't go bragging about illnesses that are embarrassing in one of your patients to any of the others. Obviously, poor Rodrigo had not read that memo. And he went and he'd never guess what I treated the Earl of Essex for. Well, people weren't impressed, particularly not Essex, and he heard and had him arrested, he said, for attempting to poison the Queen. And why would he poison the Queen? Obviously, because he's Spanish. But he was Jewish and he had to escape. No. He's got extensive correspondence with Spanish friends of his. The charges were ludicrous, but he did find correspondence that Rodrigo Lopez had written. And the fact that he'd written it in Spanish at all proved that he must be a spy who's working for the Spanish government. And Lopez was, in those days, they didn't mess about. He was hung, drawn, and quartered. Elizabeth refused to believe the story. That means she trusted that he'd never tried to poison her, and she supported his family for the rest of her reign with a significant pension. Interestingly enough, in 1601, which was just 2 years before Elizabeth died, the Earl of Essex was arrested for trying to organize a coup against Elizabeth. You see, he was really seditious, and he was executed, and she died a couple of years later, and that's how the story ended. Two interesting Jews who lived in Great Britain, in England, during this period between 1290 and 1656. Interestingly enough, Lopez was such a prominent Jew in the court of Elizabeth I that he was used as the model by Shakespeare for Shylock. And if you read Shakespearean history, he was the only Jew that Shakespeare ever met. And much of the dialogue, apparently, it's been suggested, was based on actual conversations that people in court would have with this chap, with Lopez, about his Jewish origins and the differences between Jews and Christians. Anyway, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about chief rabbis. So we're now back to after 1656. What do you think qualifies someone to become a chief rabbi? Don't all shout out at once. What qualifies? Well, it's an interesting question. So let's look in Jewish history. The Nasi of the Sanhedrin. How was the Nasi of the Sanhedrin chosen? The Nasi. Rabban Gamliel. Rabbi Loza ben Azariah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. How was he chosen? There was a caucus. Who were the caucus? His peers, the other rabbis. They would decide who's the most distinguished rabbi. I mean, they did particularly go for the descendants of Hillel, although Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was not a descendant of Hillel. They tended to go for the descendants of Hillel. But if you wanted to be the chief rabbi, the way to be the chief rabbi was for all the other rabbis to choose you. Chief rabbis are not chosen by rabbis. They're chosen by a committee of lay people. And generally speaking, they are a reflection of those people. And the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of England was a perfect example of this. Impressive-looking chap. Chief Rabbi Aaron Hart. His actual name was Uri Feivish. By the way, does anyone know the origin of the Yiddish name Feivish? And why is it always, the name is always a double name, Shraga Feivish or Uri Feivish? Does anyone know? Phoebus. Apollo. Phoebus is actually, in classical mythology, Apollo is the sun god. Whenever you meet someone called Feivish, the reason he's called Feivish is because he's named after a pagan god. Now that's rather embarrassing, because you're going to call somebody up to the Torah, Ya'amoid, Apollo ben Meir, it doesn't work, right? So they wanted to add a Hebrew name which is appropriate. Well, he was the god of the sun, so they added the name either Shraga, which means flame, or Uri, which means my light. So Uri Feivish or Shraga Feivish, that's why that name exists. Just another digression, one of Pini Dunner's specials, something for you to say around the Shabbos table. In any event, back to Aaron Hart. He was a failed businessman from Germany. And his younger brother, Moses, was an extremely successful businessman who'd moved to London. And in 1704, he brought his brother. We'll go back to Aaron Hart. Very impressive fellow. This is in the National Portrait Gallery, Looks very rabbinic, doesn't he? Doesn't look like a failed businessman to me. He was recognized as the chief rabbi of all the Ashkenazi Jews in England, and in fact, he's the longest-serving chief rabbi in British history, more than 50 years. I'll tell you one story about him. One day, a member of his community came to visit. Hello, Rabbi. Everything all right? Yes, his name is Osher Anshul Cohen. He says, well, you'd never believe it. I'm drowning in debt, and I need to run away. And my wife is going crazy. And she says she wants me to get divorced because I may never come back, and then she's going to be in Aguna. So he said, where are you going? He said, I'm going to the West Indies, to Jamaica, wherever it was in those days. It was a dangerous trip, but it could be, taken by pirates, killed, who knows? Maybe he just never wanted to come back. And his wife was very happy to accept a get. The problem was that the son-in-law of the sofer of the Ashkenazi community was owed money by Osher Anshel Cohen. So if the sofer found out that Osher Anshel was leaving England, he'd tell his son-in-law to chase him for the money. He didn't have money to pay him. By the way, he'd lost the money in a card game. So Aaron Hart secretly arranged for the Sephardi sofer to write the get. And Osher Anshel disappeared, and he never came back. Oh, it's not the end of the story. Because when the story emerged, people were furious, and they denounced the get as a sham, which meant that she couldn't remarry. So she was still an aguna, because she didn't receive the get, because it's not a good get. And one person who was extremely angry was a man called Mordechai Hamburger. He was from Hamburg, who published a book called Maaseh Rav. Where are we? Maaseh Rav. Tshuvas HaGaonim. It had a few pages at the beginning, which was apparently some material from medieval scholars, but really the book was a polemic against Rabbi Aaron Hart's get. The author was a teacher who Mordechai Hamburger had employed. He brought to London to teach his children because he didn't want them to go off the derech, chas v'sholom. So he brought this fellow, and Hamburger had the book published in Amsterdam, and he was thrown out of the community. Not a problem. He just opened an alternative shul. It was known as the Hambro Shul. It was one of the principal shuls of early British Jewry. But Aaron Hart, I mean, after all, he's a chief rabbi. He can't allow, it's not appropriate for him to allow people to criticize him publicly for having issued a get. And it's a terrible thing to say that a get, by the way, it is a terrible thing to invalidate a get. It's one of the worst things that you can do in rabbinic law. So he published the book. It's a book called Urim v'Tumim. In 1707, my friends, no Hebrew book had been published in the British Isles until this book was published. How proud are we that the first book ever published in Great Britain was a polemic? Really, something to be proud of if you're British and Jewish. The next chief rabbi was Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Levine. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Levine is a very interesting man, and he's really going to form the foundation for the next piece, the next story that I'm going to tell you. He was the son of one of the most famous rabbinic families of Europe. His father, Rabbi Aryeh Leib Lowenstein, was the son of Rabbi Scholl, who was the rabbi of Krakow, and he was the rabbi of Reisha, of Lvov, and other places. Eventually, he became the rabbi in Amsterdam, and he was married to the daughter of Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi, which made him the brother-in-law of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. And in fact, he was deeply involved. For those of you who have read my book, he was part of the team, small but quite vociferous team of rabbis who defended Rabbi Yaakov Emden. And when Rabbi Yaakov Emden was expelled from Hamburg, he went to live with his brother-in-law in Amsterdam for a year. His son, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Levine, he was named after his grandfather because he died just a couple of years after. His grandfather died in 1718, and he was born in 1721, and he was named after him. His mother died, Miriam, the daughter of Chacham Tzvi, died in 1753. Reb Aryeh Leib, that's his father, died in 1755. Obviously, there wasn't a very big Yerusha. He was offered the job to be the chief rabbi of London. A plum position, offered a lot of money, £250 a year plus expenses. I can assure you that that may not sound a lot. In those days, that was a very significant sum of money for a rabbi to be paid, and he was paid on time. Reb Tzvi Hirsch lasted 7 years in London. He left when he was offered a job for much less money in a place called Halberstadt. And the reason he accepted the job was because they also promised him that they would help him by bringing in 12 scholars to sit in some type of yeshiva or kollel in Halberstadt. And he moved, and the community in London were extremely upset, and they had a meeting about it, and they decided to send a representative of the board to ask him why he was leaving. And he came, knocked on the door. He said, Rabbi, we're very, very upset. Why is it that you're leaving London? He said, because that's the first shaila anyone's asked me. In 1772, he was appointed to be the rabbi of Berlin. Between he'd been the rabbi in Mannheim, it was the height of the period of the Haskalah, and it was the home of Moses Mendelssohn. They did clash a little, although Reb Tzvi Hirsch Levine was not somebody who liked controversy and machlokas. And he had a tough time keeping the peace between hardliners in his rabbinic world and the maskilim and the reformers on the other side. And he tended to avoid conflict, but it was constant. He once quipped that in London I had money but no Jews. In Halberstadt and Mannheim I had Jews but no money. But in Berlin I have neither one nor the other. In 1802, his son, Rabbi Solomon Herschel, was appointed the chief rabbi of Great Britain, and he remained in that job for 40 years until 1842. And again, he'll be the subject of a lecture for another time. But I want to actually focus on the Besamim Rosh. Besamim Rosh, I think it was mentioned in the blurb on the flyer about this lecture. I'm not going to focus too much on Tzvi Hirsch Berlin. Tzvi Hirsch Berlin had a son. His oldest son was Shaul Berlin. He was born in 1740. We don't have any kind of image of him to show you. His father at the time was a very young man, less than 20 years old. He moved to London with his father in 1756, a vulnerable age. He was 16, and presumably he remained in that environment for his formative years. His father left in 1763. At some point, he married the daughter of another distinguished rabbinic family, Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef Tumim Frankel, the chief rabbi of Breslau, who was also a wealthy businessman. So he was set up in the rabbinic world. He got himself a position. He was well supplied for in terms of his parnassa. And after he died, I'm just going to mention this as an aside, and we'll get back to it later. Shaul Berlin died in 1794. He was only 54 years old. And his widowed wife, Sarah Gittel, married Rabbi Yaakov Meir Eger, who was the brother of Rabbi Akiva Eger's father, which made her Rabbi Akiva Eger's aunt. Later on, she was also the great aunt of the Chassam Sofer. It's also interesting. She died in 1830. She was 86 years old, ancient. I mean, I don't know if she got a telegram from the Queen, but in those days, if you lived to 80 years old or 85 years old, you should have got a telegram from someone. And she lived to a very ripe old age. It's going to be important later on in this story. But back to Shaul Berlin, a child prodigy, rabbinically trained by his father, who himself was a child prodigy and a great rabbi. He was attracted to the emerging Haskalah movement. There's no question that his interests lay beyond the rabbinic world. He was a gifted writer. He said this was interesting. At the beginning of the Haskalah period, Hebrew changed. You think, how can Hebrew change? Hebrew was not a language of communication that people spoke it. It wasn't a vernacular. Nobody met each other in the street and said, Ma shlomcha. There was no such thing. People didn't say shalom. They spoke Yiddish. Or perhaps they spoke a local language, but they certainly didn't speak Hebrew. Hebrew was entirely a written language. But over the centuries, it had developed into a very flowery language. And the more flowery you presented your Hebrew in written communications, the greater scholar you were. At the beginning of the Haskalah period, that all changed because they realized that they wanted Hebrew to become a language of general communication. The more flowery and difficult it is to understand Hebrew, the less people can read it. And we want people who aren't scholars to get an appreciation of Hebrew. So while they retained flowery Hebrew for poetry, and there was a lot of poetry, when it came to communication or writing Sfarim, the style of Hebrew changed significantly during that period. So Reb Shaul Berlin was extremely good at writing Hebrew in a less flowery style, although when he wanted to, he could use the flowery style usually as a method to poke fun at fellow rabbis. So he would write in such a way as that the fellow rabbis would recognize that he was really taking the mick. In any event, his first written output was something which was not published until after he died, called Ksav Yosher. It was a satire written in defense of a man called Naftali Hertz Wiesel. He wrote a book called Divrei Shalom Ve'emes, which was a critique of rabbinic Jewish education. And he was roundly criticized by anybody who read the book who came from the rabbinic world. And he was a friend of Mendelssohn, And Divrei Shalom Ba'emes really was an attempt by him to improve Jewish education, change the whole style of Jewish education. As I said, traditional rabbis were outraged. And what does one do in a situation like this but come to the defense of your friend? And Shaul Berlin was his friend. He wrote this piece, it's called Ksav Yosher, in which he ripped the critics to pieces, but it was never published. It was circulated as a written manuscript among those people who would be interested. He made clever satirical use of Bible and Talmudic quotes to promote Wesley and his cause, and it was a mockery, really, of strict rabbinics. But nobody knew that he had written it. It was written anonymously. Wesley, by the way, was a Talmud of Rabbi Yonasan Ebershitz, which is interesting because, as I've told you, Rabbi Shaul Berlin was a great nephew of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, but the sands were shifting by then, and these old enmities were being set aside, and the new lines were being drawn in the Jewish world as to who supported whom and who was going to advocate for what. Berlin's next book was much more controversial. It's called Mitzpeh Yekuel. It was a vicious satire aimed at a book called Toras Yekusiel. Toras Yekusiel was written by the chief rabbi of the triple community, Hamburg, Wandsbek, and Altona, which today it's all one big city called Hamburg. In those days it was three separate entities, one of which was under the jurisdiction of the King of Denmark. And the rabbi's name was Rabbi Raphael HaKohen Hamburger, and he was, I don't want to use the word Haredi because that word doesn't really exist in the 1700s, but he was certainly a radical in terms of his proposing very traditional Jewish values and ideas, and totally opposed to any kind of modernity or changes. He was a Litvak. He was a Talmud of the Shagas Aryeh. He was an admirer of the Vilna Gaon, who was around the same age as him, and he was the rabbi and Rosh Yeshiva of various towns and yeshivas in Lithuania. He was the first Rebbe of Reb Chaim of Volozhin, and he was unique in that he was admired by both Hasidim and Misnagdim during a period where there was great divisions between these two communities. He refused to take sides. He came to Berlin to publish his book in 1772, and they offered him the rabbinate. That's how distinguished he was, and he didn't take the position. He published his book, Toras Yekusiel. Interestingly enough, Reb Shaul Berlin's father, Reb Tzvi Hirsch, did take the position in Berlin and became the chief rabbi there. So he published the book, Toras Yekusiel. Here is my copy, the title page. And in his introduction, he explains why it's quite hard to understand, quite unique. He didn't take any haskamot. Do you know what a haskama is? You write a sefer, you send some sample galleys to some distinguished rabbis, and they write an approbation, a haskama, which you then publish in a place of pride at the front of the book, so that people should know that it's not just your stuff, but that there's great rabbis who read it, and they agree that this is extremely good and worth reading. He didn't publish his book with any haskamas. He gave two reasons why he didn't do that. First of all, he didn't want to be embarrassed by exaggerated praise. He felt that that would be inappropriate. And the second reason he gave is that he felt it would be dishonest because there's no way that a busy rabbi would read everything he would send them. They would read a few pages, they'd write the haskama based on that, and then they later on might be extremely embarrassed to discover that there was stuff in the book that they hadn't endorsed. So he didn't include a haskama. Now, we're now many years later, and this Rabbi Raphael Hamburger from Hamburg, is a thorn in the side of the Maskilim. They wanted to silence their critic, and they needed to destroy his reputation. So in 1789, they published this book. Where is it? Mitzpeh Yekuel. And it's published under the name, you can see it there at the bottom, Ovadia ben Harav Morenu Harav Baruch. Any of you ever heard of him? No, you didn't hear of him because he never existed. He was a made-up name. So in the introduction, the publishers wrote that there was this itinerant Polish guy who 10 years before had once visited the shul, very, very learned, and they've got into conversation with him. He was the most marvelous person. We really loved him, and he's such a scholar. We've kept in touch with him all the years. Anyway, he tells us that a few months ago, he chanced upon a book called Notorious. You'd never believe it, in Poland. And he read through the book, and what a bunch of nonsense. And he felt compelled to write an entire book against this Notorious, and he knows that it's important to them. He's sending them the manuscript. He really can't afford to publish it, but if they have a few spare groschen, maybe they can publish this book. And guess what they did? Isn't it very kind of them to publish this book from somebody they hardly know? But that's what they did. They published Mitzpeh Yekuel, and one of the things he criticized was that there was no Haskalah. How can you publish a book with no Haskalah? He said, but there's an obvious answer. Who would endorse such nonsense? Had he sent the book to any great rabbis, they would never have written a letter. In fact, he said, maybe they did send it, and the letters he got back were so bad that he didn't publish them. Rabbi Hamburger, he said, was guilty of offering incredible leniencies that would cause people to wantonly sin. The book was about Yeridea, and he said it would cause people to sin by eating non-kosher food. I mean, if you eat treif meat, that's the worst thing you can do. So he decided that he needed to write this book to prevent people from eating treif. Now, there is no more nonsensical accusation against a rabbi of Rabbi Hamburger's stature and standing than to say that he would deliberately give people treif meat. So the whole thing was really to undermine his reputation. It didn't take too long for people to compare the writing style with other people that they knew didn't like the sort of frummer end of the community. And lo and behold, the author was none other than Rabbi Shaul Berlin. And he'd written it pseudonymously. What's particularly interesting is that in the publisher's intro, they explained that the book was only meant for a learned audience, and they listed rabbis to whom the book would be sent, including the Vilna Gaon and the Noida Behuda. Guess what? Two very close friends of Rabbi Raphael Hamburger. The reaction to the book was furious. A ban was published by the Hamburg Beis Din. They put the author in cherem without naming him, because, of course, he hadn't yet admitted that it was him. They went to his father, Reb Tzvi Hirsch Levine, and they said, this book against your friend from Hamburg is a disgrace. You should sign it, this ban. Make sure that we put the author in cherem. It's a terrible thing. And he said, you're absolutely right. And somebody whispered into his ear, it's your son. And he didn't sign the ban. Mitzpeh Yekuel, so that's one story. I mean, that would have been enough, right, to ruin someone's reputation, but it wasn't apparently enough. Berlin was working on a much bigger project, one which he'd been working on for years, before he finally published it in 1753. The project was based on a manuscript that Berlin said was found by Rabbi Isaac de Molina in the 16th century. The manuscript was copied for him, sent to him for publication, contained 392 responsa of the Rosh. Rabbeinu Osher, we'll get to him in a minute. So he called the Sefer Besamim Rosh. Besamim is gematria 392. Besamim means spices, right? These are the spices of the Rosh. Who was the Rosh? Rabbeinu Osher ben Yechiel, one of the most prominent of all the medieval halachic authorities. He was a Talmudist. He was born in Cologne. He was a Talmud of Maram Rothenburg, Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg. And he was forced to move to Spain. There were persecutions. In those days, that was no surprise. He ended up being the rabbi of Toledo. He died there in 1327. He was one of the first Ashkenazi rabbis to convert the Talmud, as it were, into a body, into a text of definitive laws. You can find it at the back of every Gemara that we have today. You have the Rosh, Rabbeinu Osher, an idea which was taken up by his son, Rabbi Yaakov, who then created something called the Tur, as a result of which we have the Shulchan Aruch. And the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Kara, was considered the Rosh as to be such a great rabbi that all his psukim consider the Rosh as one. There's 3 rabbis who he takes into consideration when reaching any kind of halachic conclusion. One of them is the Rosh. That's how great he was. Oh, can you imagine now? You have to tell you that the Tshuvas HaRosh is not a new thing. The Tshuvas HaRosh were questions and answers that were posed to him during his time as a rabbi, mainly in Germany, France, and then later Spain. And they were published, they were circulated as manuscripts. Here's a manuscript from the 15th century, that's the 1400s, of the Tshuvas HaRosh, was later published. This is a version that was published in Venice in 1607. It was widely studied, it was admired. Imagine the surprise and excitement when an entirely new collection of Tshuvas of the Rosh came to light. What a discovery! This is fantastic. I mean, the rabbinic world was going wild. The Besamim Rosh, here it is, the spices of the Rosh, and he added his own commentary, Kasa de Harsana, long tract after each tshuva. So it would say, Nishalti, I was asked the following question, and then he would, the Rosh, as it were, would give the answer, and then you'd have the Kasa de Harsana, Rabbi Shaul Berlin's long explanation of all the different elements not mentioned by the Rosh. It was an incredible book. It remains an incredible book. And the Besamim Rosh had 2 Haskamas, one from his father. The other one was from the Noida Behuda. I have to say that the Haskama from the Noida Behuda is a little weak. Have I got them here? Yes, there they are. The one on the left is from the Noida Behuda, the chief rabbi of Prague. He said, I've been ill, I can't really focus on stuff at the moment, but the truth is the Rosh speaks for itself. It doesn't need my Haskama. Good luck with the book. Have a nice life. That's what the Haskama, you don't have to read the whole thing through. I just summarized it. Now I have to tell you that the Besamim Rosh was quoted extensively for many years after the story that I'm about to tell you happened by some of the greatest rabbis of modern Jewish history. Rabbi Akiva Eiger, remember him? We'll get back to him. Chidushei Harim, Chassidish Rebbe, quotes the Besamim Rosh extensively, and the Kasa de Harsana. Rabbi Yosef Shaul Natanzon, the Sholem Meshiv, one of the greatest halachic authorities of the 19th century, regularly quotes the Besamim Rosh. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Levine, in his Haskama, of course, was extremely excited. I mean, this was a life's work. He said that Besamim Rosh is the most wonderful publication he'd ever seen, and you need to read it. That's what he wrote. But not everybody was very happy with it. Something didn't seem right, and it wasn't just the person who brought it to print. Within months, there was a man called Rabbi Wolf Landsberg. I don't know much about him, but he published a book. It was a total repudiation of the Besamim Rosh. He titled it Ze'ev Yitroif. That's my copy. And he claimed it must be forged. The entire book, every single section that contained quotations of the Rosh, were forged. It's not possible. In the intro, he noted that Berlin had, in fact, Reb Shaul Berlin had retracted one of the tshuvas. In one of the tshuvas, he claimed that the Rosh had said, you're allowed to shave on Chol HaMoed. And his father, as it turns out, was very against shaving on Chol HaMoed, so he issued a retraction. Here it is, Modah Rabbah. Shortly before Pesach of 1793, he published this flyer that went around all the communities in Germany to say that he'd made a mistake to say it was permitted to shave on Chol HaMoed based on the tshuva of the Rosh. Landsberger assumed that he had done so to save his father embarrassment, and this act truly cast doubt on everything else. There was another man called Rabbi Mordechai Banet. He was the chief rabbi of Moravia, and he wrote very respectfully, he wrote a letter to Reb Tzvi Levine, the father of the publisher, and he queried a number of the tshuvot, saying it seemed unlikely that a Rishon would say the things that he had said. I'm going to just tell you some of the things that the Besamim Rosh claimed in the name of the Rosh. You're allowed to change the order of davening if it suits you. You're allowed to drink stam yain, wine from Gentiles. You can pray in any language. Doesn't really ring true if you're thinking about a medieval rabbi. Some really weird tshuvas. Listen to this one. The story, a fellow comes to the Rosh. This is what it's in the Besamim Rosh. You can look it up. If you want to look it up, you can find it online. I believe it's in HebrewBooks.org. This is number 174 of the tshuvas. Listen to this story. A fellow comes and he says, my daughter's about to get married. In those days, if the nobleman heard that a girl was getting married and she'd never previously been married or had a relationship, then he wanted to have the right of the first night. It was during the 9 days, and what they wouldn't do is once the girl was married, then they wouldn't do that. They would only do it before the girl was married. By the time, listen to this, by the time the nobleman got to wherever it was, it would be after Tisha B'Av. So the only way, this is Erev Tisha B'Av, the only way that we can have the wedding is if it takes place on Tisha B'Av. Are we allowed to have a Sudas mitzvah with music on Tisha B'Av if we have a wedding? That's the shaila. Little bit of a weird story. And you have to think, in the background, what's going on here is this is the type of stuff that the maskilim, that the reformers were saying, made Rabbinic Judaism so ridiculous. Because listen to what's going on here. It's extremely important for somebody to get married, to d'oraisa. But Tisha B'Av is only a d'Rabbanan, it's only a rabbinic law. Surely we can set aside a rabbinic law in favor of a Torah law. It's trying to prove how ridiculous the setup of the halachic system is. Now you're thinking to yourself, no, but of course the Rosh would have a question like that. Yes, but then we'd have similar types of questions in the Tshuvas Rosh, which have been published hundreds of years before. Why is it that only in this weird manuscript that no one had ever seen, that these tshuvas come up? Others were reminiscent of contemporary issues. You're not allowed to impose the will of the majority on a minority. If there's a minority of people who do one thing, you can't say the majority has the right to force the minority to change. Oral law can change, was another one of the tshuvas that can be found in the Besamim Rosh. Anyway, it's all far too convenient. And particularly now that we know that Reb Shaul Berlin was a reform sympathizer, how is it that exactly, like, of all the people in Europe to have discovered a manuscript of the Rosh Tshuvas that say things like this, it just happened to be the guy who was the brilliant writer and the publicist of the Maskilim and the emerging reform movement. But Tzvi Berlin robustly supported his son. He claimed he'd known about and seen the manuscript for over 10 years. That's what he wrote back in a letter. The shine was off. So I can't explain why Reb Shaul Berlin said that. I have a theory. My theory is that there was an existing manuscript of Tshuvas Rosh, and that didn't appear in the Rosh. And it's very possible that Reb Shaul Berlin bought them or had them, somebody gave them to him, but they didn't say what it said in the Tshuvas Rosh, in the Besamim Rosh. He then had embellished it or added to it in such a way that he could promote and propose ideas which were antithetical to Rabbinic Judaism. In any event, he was completely shocked by the outrage. He thought that this was going to be an amazing thing. It would set him up for life as one of the great rabbinic authorities of Europe. But he was hounded and he ran away. I mean, when you're hounded, where do you go? He ran away to London, where he died shortly afterwards. This is a picture or plaque that's on his grave in Alderney Road Cemetery. By the way, I just want to tell you how I got the book. It's an interesting story. Many years ago, I'm generally offered books that nobody else wants to buy. I was approached by a dealer in Stamford Hill. He said, I've got a book for you, the Besamim Rosh. I said, what's the Besamim Rosh? He told me, I'd never heard of it before. I'm going back 20 years. So he said to me, I checked around. They said it's a good book. How much is it worth? Well, $300-400. So I went back to him and I said to him, I'll give you £100 for it. He said, done. Deal is done. That's a bargain, right? I mean, I'm really doing well. Okay, I thought to myself, I should have offered him 50. Anyway, I gave him £100 and I opened the Besamim Rosh and I discovered why he was so eager to get rid of it. It was from the yeshiva in Bobov. And apparently they discovered this book and shown it to the Rosh Hashiva, and he said they have to get rid of it immediately, within 24 hours. And they found Pini Dunner, and he bought it. Had I known that, I might have even got it for nothing. Anyway, even contemporary poskim quote the Besamim Rosh, including Rabbi Nashe Klein, Rabbi Sholem Messas, Rabbi Elyashiv quotes the Besamim Rosh. Quite remarkable. So the question you're probably all thinking to yourself is, was it actually forged? And this question has vexed rabbis and Jewish historians for over 2 centuries. If yes, if he did forge it, why did he do it? That's an interesting question as well. Why do literary forgers engage in such weird activities? Why would you forge a book? Just write a book in your own name. Since there's many books and articles and theses that have been written about literary forgery. I think that there's no real good defense. Levine tried to defend him. I think, if you want my opinion, is that he needed to write, and the stuff that he wanted to write, he could never write in his own name. And I think that he needed to wear this mask of being a rabbinic scholar, which he wasn't really inside. And he certainly didn't want to disrespect his father. His father was a very distinguished man and a very famous rabbi. And you see that when something contradicted his father, he immediately issued a retraction. And I think that literary forgery, I'm not a psychologist, but was his only outlet. It gave him a free hand to say the things that he wanted to say without negative consequences. I mean, how come it remained within rabbinic works and why Rabbi Akiva Eiger quoted it? Well, I think the Rabbi Akiva Eiger one we can understand. He didn't want to offend his auntie, right? His aunt had been married to Reb Shaul Berlin, but there were others. So Reb Meir Dan Plotsky, who was a famous rabbi in Poland, who actually was the one who exposed the forged Yerushalmi, also the subject of another lecture. He wrote an article, it's a very obscure article in a rabbinic journal in 1919. Here's the article, I found it and read it through, about the Besamim Rosh. His suggestion is that Berlin was innocent. He was himself the subject of a hoax. That means somebody gave him these tshuvas, knowing that they would excite him and that he would publish them, and they said that they were from the Rosh. I don't know. It doesn't really, I can't believe that. And how would that enable other people to quote him? I mean, clearly the Chasam Sofer says that these tshuvas are all forged. My view is that Berlin was a brilliant rabbinic scholar, but a tortured soul torn between 2 worlds, and he wanted to reconcile them. And the Besamim Rosh presented a portal into the future, as he saw it, for religious Jews, offering answers to questions that were turning people away.